All right, guys. So this brings us to our next part of night that we're going to be focusing on, which is going to be pages 29 through 34 and then 61 through 65. So this deals largely with Ellie's experience in the concentration camp when he's first brought there. We're just going to start on page 29. So they have been taken from their homes. They have no idea where they're going. They have been threatened. They've been beaten. They're terrified. They're hungry. They're scared. They don't have any valuables. They're pretty much at their lowest right now. And that's where the Germans needed them, really, in order to kind of move them into these camps. Okay. So this is on page 29. The beloved objects that we carried with us from place to place were now left behind in the wagon, and with them, finally, our illusions. Every few yards there stood an SS man, his machine gun trained on us. Hand in hand, we followed the throng. An SS came toward us, wielding a club. He commanded, "Men to the left, women to the right." 8 words, spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. 8 simple, short words. Yet that was the moment when I left my mother. There was no time to think, and I already felt my father's hand press against mine. We were alone. In a fraction of a second, I could see my mother and my sisters move to the right. Zipporah was holding my mother's hand. I saw them walking farther and farther away. Mother was stroking my sister's blonde hair as if to protect her, and I walked on with my father, with the men. I didn't know that this was the moment in time and the place where I was leaving my mother and Zipporah forever. I kept walking, my father holding my hand. So already we're seeing the difference between Ellie and his father's relationship in the first chapter and Ellie and his father's relationship now. So he's staying with his father. He is holding his father's hand. There's a moment of closeness here that we haven't really seen yet. And it's because everything else has been taken away from them. They're going to be all that they have left because the women have been parted from the men. So Ellie's mother and his sister actually both die on the very first night in Auschwitz. He doesn't find this out until many years later. But probably because his mother was too old, his sister was too young. Maybe his mother refused to be parted from his sister. We don't really know how exactly, but they were killed on that very first night because they weren't useful. They were not going to be good workers because Zipporah was so young. And so this, I think, is so important. This 8 words spoken quietly, indifferently, without emotion. Again, it's like that without passion or haste that we talked about in the first chapter. It's not hatred. It's just fact. These people go this way. These people go that way. And your whole life changes, which is just horrifying. His other 2 sisters, his older 2 sisters, actually do survive the Holocaust, and they're reunited later. You don't actually see it in this novel. He wrote a second one that deals with that, with his kind of aftermath of dealing with the concentration camp. But his mother and his youngest sister both die that very first night. Behind me, an old man fell to the ground. Nearby, an SS man replaced his revolver in its holster. My hand tightened its grip on my father. All I could think of was not to lose him, not to remain alone. And again, we're seeing the strengthening of that bond. The most important thing in this camp to Ellie is his father. That is all that he cares about now. The SS officer gave the order. "Form ranks of 5s. There was a tumult. It was imperative to stay together. Imperative means really, really important. "Hey, kid, how old are you?" The man interrogating me was an inmate. I could not see his face, but his voice was weary and warm. 15? "No, you're 18. "But I'm not," I said. "I'm 15. "Fool, listen to what I say." Then he asked my father, who answered, "I'm 50. "No," the man now sounded angry. "Not 50, you're 40. Do you hear? 18 and 40. He disappeared into the darkness. Another inmate appeared, unleashing a stream of invectives, which is cuss words. "Sons of bitches, why have you come here? Tell me, why?" Someone dared to reply, "What do you think, that we came here of our own free will? That we asked to come here?" The other seemed ready to kill him. "Shut up, you moron, or I'll tear you to pieces. Should have hanged yourselves rather than come here. Didn't you know what was in store for you here in Auschwitz? You didn't know in 1944? True, we didn't know. Nobody had told us. He couldn't believe his ears. His tone became even harsher. So Auschwitz is probably the most notorious camp. It's the one that everybody knows. And it was open for a long time. So our first mass transit of prisoners to Auschwitz happens in June of 1940. Less than a year later, March of 1941, and that was 728 people, so a little under 1,000. Less than a year later, it had grown to 11,000 people were being kind of held prisoner at Auschwitz. And then we start to see the first mass transit of Jewish people, just Jewish people, around 1942. So by 1944, Auschwitz has become a death camp for the last 2 years, basically, where we have people moving almost directly from the station to the crematoria to be gassed and then burned. So this prisoner, rather, this isn't a Nazi, these are prisoners. This prisoner is so upset because Ellie and his family had time, right? For 2 years now, this camp has been killing thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And, Ellie and his family had never heard of it. They're saying that they didn't even know that it existed. So it just kind of shows, again, how far removed the people of Segget were from this, but also kind of what a well-kept secret this was by the Nazis, that this was kind of existing. Though the irony, of course, of Ellie saying, we didn't know, nobody had told us, is not true, right? They knew. They'd heard from Moishe Beadle exactly what was happening, and they chose not to believe it because it was easier. True, we didn't know. Nobody had told us. He couldn't believe his ears. His tone became harsher. Over there, do you see that chimney over there? Do you see it? And the flames, do you see them? Yes, we saw the flames. Over there, that's where they will take you. Over there will be your grave. You still don't understand, you sons of bitches. Don't you understand anything? You will be burned to a cinder, turned into ashes. His anger changed into fury. We stood stunned, petrified. Could this be just a nightmare, an unimaginable nightmare? I heard whispers around me. We must do something. We can't let him kill us like that, like cattle in the slaughterhouse. We must revolt. There were among us a few tough young men. They actually had knives and were urging us to attack the armed guards. One of them was muttering, "Let the world learn about the existence of Auschwitz. Let everyone find out about it while they still have the chance to escape." But the older men begged their sons not to be foolish. We mustn't give up hope. Even now, as the sword hangs over our heads, so taught our sages. The wind of revolt died down. We continued to walk until we came to a crossroads. Standing in the middle of it was, though I didn't know it then, Dr. Mengele, the notorious Dr. Mengele. He looked like the typical SS officer, a cruel, though not unintelligent face, complete with monocle. He was holding a conductor's baton and was surrounded by officers. The baton was moving constantly, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. In no time, I stood before him. Your age, he asked, perhaps trying to sound paternal. I'm 18. My voice was trembling. In good health? Yes. Your profession? Tell him I was a student. Farmer, I heard myself saying. So Dr. Mengele is so notorious means famous, but for a bad thing. He is easily one of the most famous Nazi doctors. He was a doctor, and he liked to perform experiments on live subjects. He was particularly intrigued by twins. So he would find inmates that were twins, and then he would do surgeries on them, see if he could swap organs for absolutely no reason, just to see if they would take. He would inflict pain on one twin to see if the other one would feel it, things like that. He was a sadist. He was a monster under the guise of being a doctor. So yeah, the fact that Ellie has run into kind of one of the most famous members of the Nazi party is kind of crazy. This conversation lasted no more than a few seconds. It seemed like an eternity. The baton pointed to the left. I took a half step forward. I first wanted to see where they would send my father. Where he'd have gone to the right, I would have run after him. So one direction means life, one direction means death. And they're making this decision in seconds, whether or not these people are fit to work or if they're fit for nothing more than the crematorium. The fact that Ellie doesn't know which direction is which, but the only thing that is important is going with his father. Right? Where he'd have gone to the right, I would have gone after him. Ellie, the only thing that he cares about now is staying with his father, right? And vice versa. They both feel that that's super important. So already we're seeing a huge change in their relationship. Whereas before they were basically strangers living in the same house, now they're the most important things in each other's world, and will be for the rest of this novel. The baton once more moved to the left. A weight lifted from my heart. We did not know as yet which was the better side, right or left, which road led to prison and which to the crematoria. Still, I was happy. I was near my father. Our procession continued slowly to move forward. Another inmate came over to us. Satisfied? Yes, someone answered. Poor devils, you're heading for the crematorium. He seemed to be telling the truth. Not far from us, huge flames, were rising from a ditch. Something was being burned there. A truck drew close and unloaded its hold. Small children, babies. Yes, I did see this with my own eyes. Children thrown into the flames. Is it any wonder that ever since then sleep tends to elude me? So that was where we were going. A little farther on, there was another larger pit for adults. I pinched myself. Was I still alive? Was I awake? How was it possible that men, women, and children were being burned and that the world kept silent? No, all this could not be real. A nightmare, perhaps. Soon I would wake up with a start, my heart pounding, and find that I was back in the room of my childhood with my books. My father's voice tore me from my daydreams. What a shame. A shame you did not go with your mother. I saw many children your age go with their mothers. His voice was terribly sad. I understood that he did not wish to see what they would do to me. He did not wish to see his only son go up in flames. My forehead was covered with cold sweat. Still, I told him that I could not believe that human beings were being burned in our times. The world would never tolerate such crimes. The world? The world is not interested in us. Today, everything is possible, even the crematoria. His voice broke. Father, I said, if that is true, then I don't want to wait. I'll run into the electrified barbed wire. That would be easier than a slow death in the flames. He didn't answer. He was weeping. His body was shaking. Everybody around us was weeping. Some began to recite Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. I didn't know whether during the history of the Jewish people, men had ever before recited Kaddish for themselves. So Kaddish is, like you said, it's their prayer for the dead, and it would be said over their kind of funerals and things like that. So the fact that they're saying it for themselves is really important because it shows us a couple of things. One, they know that they're going to die, so they want to make sure that it's said over them. Two, they know that it's possible that the people who would normally say it over them, their family, their friends, their rabbi, that those people are also probably dead. So it is unlikely that they would be able to say Kaddish for them. So it's sad, it's horrifying, but it also shows how he was exterminating not just a people, but a culture and a religion along with it. Yiskadal Veis Kadash Shmei Rabbah. May his name be celebrated and sanctified, whispered my father. For the first time, I felt anger rising within me. Why should I sanctify his name? The Almighty, the eternal and terrible master of the universe, chose to be silent. What was there to thank him for? So already we're seeing a big change in Ellie's personality here. When we first meet him in the novel, he is 13 years old. He's deeply devout. He cries in church. He wants nothing more than to attend synagogue and study the Jewish religion. And now he's mad at God. He's angry and he is lashing out for obvious reasons. We continued our march. We were coming closer and closer to the pit from which an infernal heat was rising. 20 more steps. If I was going to kill myself, this was the time. Our column had only some 15 steps to go. I bit my lips so that my father would not hear my teeth chattering. 10 more steps. 8, 7. We were walking slowly as one follows a hearse, our own funeral procession. Only 4 more steps. 3. There it was now, very close to us, the pit and its flames. I gathered all that remained of my strength in order to break rank and throw myself onto the barbed wire. Deep down, I was saying goodbye to my father, to the whole universe, and against my will, I found myself whispering the words, Yiskadal Ve'ish Kadash Shmei Rabbah. May his name be exalted and sanctified. My heart was about to burst. There I was, face to face with the angel of death. No. 2 steps from the pit, we were ordered to turn left and herded into the barracks. I squeezed my father's hand. He said, "Do you remember Mrs. Schachter from the train?" She was screaming. We skipped chapter 2, but she was screaming fire the entire time, in a huge bit of foreshadowing. So why march them? So they didn't march them in a straight line from the selection to the barracks. Instead, they march them all the way down and then they turn right in front of these pits and then march them to the barracks. Why do that? Why do that? It's clearly not the quickest way. So why are they doing that? The only thing I can think is that they wanted to show them exactly what it was that they were capable of. This is what will happen to you if you step out of line. This is the fate that is waiting for you if you are no longer useful. And that is a powerful, powerful motivator. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. So this is kind of a break in the normal style of his writing. It's almost poetry, that kind of repeated "Never shall I forget" over and over and over again. Um, this was a transformative moment in Ellie's life. His life will never, ever, ever be the same. And it's changed at 14 years old. This kid is younger than you guys are. And he knows from this moment on that he will never, ever, ever be the same. He'll never be able to sleep. He'll never be able to kind of deal with what's going on. He might heal from it, but the reality is that it never goes away. And, it talks about how it murdered his God. So it kills his faith, it kills his will to live, it kills everything. And it was one night, right, where he sees all of these horrible things. All right, so we're going to skip ahead to page 61. So everything in between. So that was Ellie's very first night in camp, and now we're moving. He's been in camp for a couple of weeks. He's experienced some pretty horrible things, and we're going to talk about this part in particular because I think it's really important. 1 week later, as we returned from work, there in the middle of the camp in the Appelplatz, which would have been like their central meeting space, stood a black gallows. We learned that gallows is where you would hang people. We learned that soup would be distributed only after roll call, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more harshly than on other days, and there were strange vibrations in the air. "Caps off," the Lagerl Teste suddenly shouted. Lagerl Teste would have been kind of an upper-ranking prisoner. So one of the crazy things about how the concentration camps were put together is that most of the people in charge, at least in terms of day-to-day stuff, were other prisoners. So there's they're called Lagerl Testes, Lager Capos. All of those are all inmates who've been put into positions of power. So you're using your inmates to oppress your other inmates, which is deeply effective. So that's kind of something to think about here. "Caps off," the Lagerl Teste suddenly shouted. 10,000 caps came off at once. "Cover your heads." 10,000 caps were back on our heads at lightning speed. The camp gate opened. An SS unit appeared and encircled us, one SS every 3 paces. The machine guns on the watchtowers were pointed toward the Appelplatz. "They're expecting trouble," whispered Juliek. 2 SS were headed toward the solitary confinement cell. They came back, the condemned man between them. He was a young boy from Warsaw, an inmate with 3 years in concentration camps behind him. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. His back was to the gallows, his face turned toward his judge, the head of the camp. He was pale, but seemed more solemn than frightened. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes were coolly assessing the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners surrounding him. The Lagerl Teste began to read the verdict, emphasizing every word. "In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number stole during the air raid. According to the law, prisoner number is condemned to death. Let this be a warning and an example to all prisoners." Nobody moved. I heard the pounding of my heart. 10,000, or the thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau and the crematoria no longer troubled me. But this boy, leaning against his gallows, upset me deeply. "The ceremony will be over soon? I'm hungry," whispered Juliek. At a sign of the Lagerl Teste, the Lager Capos stepped up to the condemned youth. He was assisted by 2 prisoners in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. So you can see how they use these little treats basically to convince them to work against their own people. The capo wanted to blindfold the youth, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, the hangman put the rope around his neck. He was about to signal his aides to pull the chair from under the young man's feet when the latter shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live liberty! My curse on Germany! My curse! My—" The executioner had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. "Caps off!" 10,000 prisoners paid their respects. "Cover your heads." Then the entire camp, block after block, filed past the hanged boy and stared at his extinguished eyes, the tongue hanging from his gaping mouth. The capos forced everyone to look him squarely in the face. Afterward, we were given permission to go back to our block and have our meal. I remember that on that evening, the soup tasted better than ever. So Ellie's not a monster. He didn't enjoy this hanging or anything like that. One of the reasons why the soup might taste better is because he's alive, right? Being that close to death makes you more grateful for the fact that you're alive. So I'm thinking that's probably what's going on here. So public education, very, very important, right? It's showing them exactly what they're capable of. It's showing them their strength, showing them what happens if they ever try to steal or whatever. They're basically saying, we will know, we will find you, and we will kill you. So making every single person look that dead kid in the face so that they all know that that is a fate that is available for them should they mess up. I watched other hangings. I never saw a single victim weep. These withered bodies had long forgotten the bitter taste of tears. Except once. The Oberkapo of the 52nd Cable Commando was a Dutchman, a giant of a man, well over 6 feet. He had some 700 prisoners under his command, and they all loved him like a brother. Nobody had ever endured a blow or even an insult from him. And this is very strange because Ellie has a Lager Capo who beats him senseless for really no reason whatsoever. So a lot of times we see that when people are given any kind of power or authority, they tend to abuse it. But this man did not, right? He was still kind to his inmates. He showed comradeship, right? He was showing that they were brothers. They had a bond with each other. In his service was a young boy, a Papel, as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. Beauty is something that probably didn't last very long at concentration camps, right? These people are starved within an inch of their lives. They're working constantly. They're terrified. They're not sleeping enough. They're in terrible conditions. They're freezing to death. So the fact that this kid is still beautiful probably is supposed to kind of symbolize his innocence, his goodness. In Buna, the Papel were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread. Understood?" But the Dutchman's little servant was beloved by all. His was the face of an angel in distress. One day, the power failed at the central electric plant in Buna. The Gestapo, summoned to inspect the damage, concluded that it was sabotage. They found a trail. It led to the block of the Dutch Oberkapo, and after a search, they found a significant quantity of weapons. So he's obviously trying to create an uprising. The Oberkapo was arrested on the spot. He was tortured for weeks on end in vain. He gave no names. He was transferred to Auschwitz and never heard from again. So Ellie has been moved from Auschwitz, which is a death camp, to Buna, which is a work camp, right? So the threat of death is not quite as high as it normally would be. But at any moment, he can be transferred back to Auschwitz. But his young Papel remained behind in solitary confinement. He too was tortured, but he too remained silent. The SS then condemned him to death, him and 2 other inmates who had been found to possess arms. This is a young boy. One day, as we returned from work, we saw the 3 gallows, 3 black ravens erected on the Appelplatz. Roll call. The SS surrounding us, machine guns aimed at us, the usual ritual. 3 prisoners in chains, and among them the Papel, the sad-eyed angel. Such a beautiful metaphor. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. This time, the Lager Capo refused to act as executioner. 3 SS took his place. So here we're seeing that it doesn't matter what kind of incentives he is given. This man, who's also Jewish, is incapable of killing this child, which shows us what a big deal this is. That this was, 1, not super normal, and 2, he was killing this one beautiful kid who everybody loved. So this symbol of innocence and beauty and love in this camp where all of those things really don't exist anymore. And he refuses to extinguish that. The 3 condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs. In unison, the nooses were placed around their necks. "Long live liberty!" shouted the men, but the boy was silent. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the 3 chairs were tipped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Caps off!" screamed the loggerel Teste. His voice quivered. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. "Cover your heads!" Then came the march past the victims. The 2 men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the 3rd rope was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes. And we were forced to look at him at close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes not yet extinguished. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me, I heard a voice answer, where he is? This is where, hanging from this gallows. That night, the soup tasted of corpses. So obviously this second hanging is much, much, much more painful for Ellie than his first one, as we can tell by this last line, that night the soup tasted of corpses. He's actually been affected by this one. Part of that is the age of the prisoner. Part of that is the beauty of the prisoner. Part of that is the fact that the kid was still alive when Ellie was walking past him. But basically, it's just a sign of the dehumanization and the cruelty of the SS. The fact that it takes SS officers to act as executioners shows that, again, they don't have the same issues that the Lager Capo does. They don't see him as a person. They don't see him as a child. They see him as a monster that has to be extinguished, that has to be gotten rid of. So for Ellie, again, a huge turning point, right? He's saying that not only is God to blame, but that God is being killed by the Nazis here in this camp every single day because of the things that they're forcing them to experience. All right. I know that ends on a bummer, but this is the Holocaust, so there is going to be some stuff like that. So let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll see you later. Bye.